Hi, this is Mr. Grove, and in this video lecture we're looking at the language or terminology of anatomy. So we're going to look at anatomical position, some directional terms, landmarks and body planes, and lastly sections and body cavities. Like a lot of science, anatomy has its own language. So before we go anywhere with this, it's like hiking in the backcountry. You can't really get to point B unless you know where point A or where your starting point is. So first of all, before we can get into all this terminology, let's understand the starting point, or what's known as the anatomical position. So almost all body terminology starts with this position, and you can see the position over here. Okay. It's kind of like standing at attention, but notice how awkward your arms are because your palms have to be in a forward position. So what you're looking at here, and we'll talk about in just a second, is an anterior view and a posterior view. So a front view and a rear view. So in looking at that, you'll notice that anterior, which by the way is also known as ventral, is the front of the body, and posterior, also known as dorsal, is the backside of the body. So that's our starting point. Now, some other terms that we need to master are superior or cranial, inferior or caudal, medial, lateral, intermediate, proximal, distal, superficial or external, and deep or internal. So kind of looking at it kind of quickly here, when we're talking about superior toward the head. If we're talking about inferior, down toward the feet. Medial is anywhere toward the midline of the body. Lateral, we're moving away from that midline. Intermediate's kind of a toughie there. It's kind of found in between the medial and the lateral. We'll look at that a little bit more in a second. Proximal and distal are really useful. So proximal closer to the main part of the body as opposed to distal being farther away. And then superficial and deep you can't see in this diagram. But again, we'll talk about it in the next slide. Okay, so let's see if we can answer a few questions. The thumb is blank to the fingers. And if you said lateral, you were correct. The thumb is lateral to the fingers. Now remember, put your hand in the anatomical position. Otherwise, this can be a confusing answer. What about the forearm is blank to the wrist? And if you said proximal, very good. The brain is blank to the spinal cord. Superior. The clavicle is blank between the sternum and the shoulder. This is the one I was talking about that can be a little bit confusing. If you said intermediate, great. The heart is blank to the arm. Toward the midline of the body. Arm is away from the midline. And here's that other one I said wasn't in the diagram itself. The skin is blank to the underlying muscles. So we say the skin is superficial to the underlying muscles. Okay, this is a lot of stuff, but if you're certainly going to go into the medical profession, you're going to want to, and if you want a better grade on some of the anatomy tests you're going to take in my class or any future class, this becomes pretty darn useful. So here's some regional terms and with an anterior view. So look these over in your textbook and here and try to get a feel for them. Some of them are pretty easy. Like most people have an understanding that nasal has something to do with the nose and oral has something to do with the mouth. Maybe less known is cervical is the neck. axillary is the armpit, etc. So having a pretty good understanding of these will help you go a long way in your study of anatomy. Here's some of the regional terms in a posterior view. And again, some of them make sense. Maybe odic you might not come to mind, that's the ear, but the spinal column or vertebral column does. Scapula maybe, brachial being the arm, etc. Some of these will be confusing, but some of them are obvious. Body planes and sections. So what I always tell my students is think of a section as a cut through a body or an organ. Okay? And the cut is through an imaginary line called a plane. So we're talking about, as we said, sections and planes. And we have three planes of the body. We have a sagittal or median plane. We have a coronal or frontal plane. And we have a transverse plane. Now, this doesn't have to be just the body. You know, you could be working on a stomach or a heart, and you can still cut these into different planes. So probably the easy way to remember is that a sagittal cut will always divide you into left and right parts. And again, what if you're doing a heart? You can make a sagittal cut through the heart, putting it into left and right. A coronal plane divides the body or the part into an anterior above and a posterior below, while a transverse cut, also known as a cross section, divides into superior and inferior parts. Taking a look at body cavities. So we have a dorsal body cavity. Remember what dorsal means. So we're at the back. I lost my cursor. There we go. Okay, so dorsal over in this area, and it can be divided into a cranial cavity and a spinal cavity. The ventral or forward body cavity is divided up into a thoracic, an abdominal, and a pelvic cavity. And sometimes they just lump the pelvic cavity straight into the abdominal cavity. There are other cavities, of course, that we'll get into as we get into those specific units. The oral, digestive, nasal, orbital, and middle ear. But for most of our discussion in this unit, the main body cavities is what you want to worry about. When you get into the medical field, it helps to be able to break these down even better. So a lot of times it's used you separate them into 4 quadrants. So here's a quadrant, quadrant, quadrant. There's your 4 quadrants. A lot of anatomy teachers, professors, anatomists in general, will separate it up even further. So take a look at these, and that'll help quite a bit. Okay, so that was your lecture on terminology. Thank you much.